trying to expedite a resolution to resolve the issues that is impacting our community that has been created by the Bristol, Virginia City landfill. As promised by the Bristol, Tennessee City Council and staff, we said that we would have Dr. Green present her findings of the toxicology study that was performed of the Bristol, Virginia landfill in an open forum. Please be mindful that there might be some questions or comments that could come up tonight that we will not be able to respond to due to potential litigation. So at this time, I'd like to turn this over to our city manager, Bill Sora.
Thank you, Mayor. I think most of you picked up an agenda as you entered the gymnasium this evening. We will have a brief presentation by Dr. Green from Green Toxicology. Following that, we will give you an opportunity for question and answers. If you have a question, and there's not a sign-up sheet, just raise your hand and come to the podium. We do ask you to come to the podium so that you'll be on the televised version, and also use the microphone. So that Dr. Green or the appropriate individual to receive the question has an opportunity to hear it. If for some reason you cannot come to the podium, I'll be glad to bring a hand microphone to you. So with that, I'd like to, we have 4 individuals with us this evening that participated in the study. First, we have Dr. Green. She is the president and senior toxicologist with Green Toxicology. Academically, she completed her Bachelor of Arts degree in chemistry from Wellesley College in Wellesley, Massachusetts. She completed her doctoral degree from the Department of Nutrition and Food Science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And then she followed that with a postdoctoral fellowship also with MIT from Cambridge. So her board certification from 1988 to the present, she's a certified in general toxology, and she's a diplomat of the American Board of Toxicology. She's offered more than 160 reports and papers and authored a book entitled In Search of Safety, Chemicals and Cancer Risk. Dr. Green currently serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Human and Ecological Risk Assessment, and is a peer reviewer for several scientific journals. Since the late 1970s, she's performed research and published and consulted in areas of food chemistry, chemical carcinogenesis, analytical chemistry, toxicology, epidemiology, health risk assessment, and regulatory policy. With her this evening is Dr. Edmund Crouch. Dr. Crouch is vice president and senior scientist with Green Technology. Dr. Crouch completed his BA in natural sciences with an emphasis in theoretical physics from the University of Cambridge in England, and then completed his doctoral degree also from the University of Cambridge in high energy physics. As I indicated, he serves as vice president of Green Toxicology. He specializes in all aspects of exposure and risk assessment. His research publications and consultant work includes numerous risk assessment projects involving air emissions, groundwater contamination, consumer exposures, worker exposures, indoor air quality, and food safety. In addition, as I indicated, Green Technology analyzed the results of samples that were taken from the Bristol, Virginia landfill. There were 2 individuals that collected those samples. They are employed by Trinity Consultants and were retained for the specific purpose of collecting the samples from the landfill. So questions related to that particular process would be best addressed to these individuals. We have with us representing Trinity Consultants this evening, Mr. Russell Bailey. He has 26 years of experience with Trinity Consultants. He has a BS in mechanical engineering from Vanderbilt and an MS in environmental engineering from the University of Illinois. We also have Keegan Wagner, who's been with Trinity Consultants since 2018. He has a BS in environmental management from Ball State University and an MS in environmental engineering from Virginia Tech. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Green for her presentation. Once she concludes, then we'll give you an opportunity for question and answers. Dr. Green.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Mr. City Manager. Thank you, everybody, both in the audience physically and online. I'm sorry that I'm not with you physically. I would love to be there. I feel that I've gotten to know some of you, Mr. Steve Graham and others in the community. And I just want to say that I feel quite honored to be able to work for you on this matter. I know that it's a very difficult problem. I know that it's a problem that you're all struggling with on both sides of the state line. I just, I'm hoping that I'll be able to help in some way. I want to talk for maybe just 5 or 10 minutes, and then I'm very eager to answer your questions. As Mr. Sawyer mentioned, I'm a chemist and toxicologist. I'm not an engineer. I know a fair amount about landfills, but I certainly don't know how to fix them. What we did is pretty straightforward, and I hope some of you had a chance to read our report. It's posted online. We did what health risk assessors do in this kind of situation. We tried to get some relevant data, and in this case, it's what specific chemicals are in the air in the neighborhoods on both sides of the state line in Bristol, Tennessee and Bristol, Virginia. We, as Mr. Sawyer mentioned, we were fortunate to be able to rely on environmental engineers from Trinity Consultants who went to the landfill and spent a day there collecting samples at 5 or 6 different places. On the landfill itself, places where we all hypothesized would be worst case emission points. So Trinity, for example, went to the area where the wells are hotter than they should be because of some subsurface smoldering reactions. They went and took a sample near where leachate water and water that's coming into the quarry is collected. They took a sample a little bit off-site where there's a composting operation, and using data both from the air samples that Trinity had collected for us for this project, combined with air samples that US EPA and its contractors had gathered and analyzed either themselves or in laboratories that Virginia DEQ oversees and uses. We were able to, I'd say, create a fairly complete picture of the quality of air in your neighborhoods. And like many such investigations, there's good news and bad news. I'll start with the good news. Well, I'll start with the bad news. The bad news you already know, the place stinks. Landfills in general smell, but this is a particularly problematic landfill. The vapors and gases that are coming off are of a quality and a quantity that's unusually high. There are several reasons for that. Some of them I understand, some of them I don't understand. And I think that's probably true of the consultants working for Bristol, Virginia as well. I know that folks are trying to get their arms around the problems and trying to fix them. There are at least 3 problems, which we can talk about in detail if you'd like later on. But the bad news you already kind of know. It's an unusually poorly operating landfill, and it's a nuisance. And the vapors and gases that are being emitted are malodorous and noxious. The good news, well, and let me say a little more bad news, or at least semi-bad news. When we look for chemicals in air, we look both for chemicals that are malodorous, sulfurous compounds, sometimes nitrogenous compounds, things that smell really bad, but aren't necessarily toxic, except at very high levels. So we look for things like hydrogen sulfide, which certainly can be toxic at very high levels, but not at the levels that we find in outdoor air. Those levels are very, very smelly, very malodorous, but they're not toxic. The concentrations are too small. But then we also look for another class of compounds, and these are called potentially hazardous air pollutants. There are about 190 of them or so. And these compounds tend not to be smelly, but they do tend at moderately high and high levels to be quite dangerous to people's health. So we did find one such compound that is a potentially hazardous compound. It's called benzene, and it was present in neighborhood air and in air right over the landfill at levels that are, I'd say 10 to 20 times higher than what you'd expect in ordinary urban or suburban environments. Benzene is always present in outdoor air. Benzene is present whenever you burn anything. Gasoline, when you burn gasoline, you get benzene in outdoor air, and actually there's benzene in unburned gasoline as well. So a little bit vaporizes off if you fill your gas tank or your lawnmower with gasoline, you're going to breathe in a little benzene. So we're always exposed to benzene, but the levels of benzene in air around the landfill and in the neighborhoods within a mile or two on either side of the state line are, as I said, on the order of 10, as much as 20 times higher than what would be attributable to ordinary emissions from cars, trucks, any kind of oil burners, gas furnaces, that sort of thing. So the landfill is a source, I would say an unusual source of benzene vapors. Interestingly, and I must say to our surprise, virtually all of the benzene has nothing to do with the garbage. What we discovered, again to our surprise, is that starting about 5 years ago now, there appears to be an underground storage tank or some other thing that probably was at one point filled with gasoline or a similar fuel, but we reckon it's gasoline, and it's leaking. We don't know where it is. We do know that folks working for Virginia DEQ and others are hot on the trail to try to figure it out, but it's been going on for about 5 years. And the good news is that nobody's drinking water contaminated with benzene. There are not public drinking water wells in the area, and as far as we can tell, there are not private drinking water wells in the area. So the good news is that although the groundwater is heavily contaminated with benzene and a few related compounds, nobody's drinking it, so that's good. But there is so much benzene in this water that as it enters the quarry and mixes with the water that's created by rainfall percolating down through the trash, what ends up happening is a high concentration of benzene in water that's being taken ultimately to the wastewater treatment plant in Bristol, Tennessee, but it's not a closed system. It's a malfunctioning system, and the folks in the on the landfill are trying to fix it, as I understand it. But it's a malfunctioning system, and so this benzene contaminated groundwater is coming in contact to a certain degree with the atmosphere, and is the major, if not the sole reason that there's more benzene in outdoor air on the landfill and near the landfill and in the immediate neighborhoods than you'd expect. So that was a bit of a surprise for us, but it's important to realize it's incidental to the garbage. It happens to commingle with the leachate, but it's not coming from the rotting trash as far as we can tell. There may be a tiny bit, but for the most part, it seems to be this off-site plume of contamination. Now, as I said, the benzene levels in outdoor air are higher than they ought to be. But here's the good news part. The good news is that although they are higher, they're not screamingly high. They're one way to think about it is they're kind of equivalent to the levels of benzene that, depending on your age, we were all breathing before catalytic converters were a thing. So if you go back several decades and look at air quality around big cities, at least, heavily trafficked interstates, traffic jams, you will find, so we're talking decades ago now, but you will find benzene in outdoor air that's at this level, if not higher. So it's pollution, to be sure. And benzene is a toxic compound that can be very harmful at high levels. But these levels, although they are higher than they ought to be, and this all ought to be run down and fixed, they're not overtly toxic. So that's pretty much our findings. There are other details, but just to summarize, and then I would love to talk with you in conversation and answer whatever questions I can. Briefly then, what we found is, first of all, what you already know, the place stinks. Let me explain a little bit actually about why that is. There are 2 or 3 reasons, I think, that the smell is particularly bad and obnoxious. One are the kind of compounds that you already know about, sulfur-based compounds like hydrogen sulfide. But we also found a few other compounds that I think are contributing to the odors. There's a small organic chemical. It's a 4-carbon long chemical called 2-butanal. It's an unstable aldehyde. It's really stinky. It has a pungent, suffocating odor at high concentrations and even at moderately low concentrations. And there is 2-butanal in the vapors coming off of this landfill. Now, it's probably caused by the biodegradation of food wastes. When microorganisms biodegrade fats in food, 2-butanal is one of the byproducts. You sometimes see it in landfills, you don't always see it. So I think that this particular landfill either has more food waste in it than normal, or maybe the degradation is happening at a different rate. In any event, that's one of the odorous compounds. There seem to be traces of ammonia, also coming from the degradation of food waste, probably proteins in this case, because ammonia is a nitrogenous compound and proteins are nitrogen rich. So I'd say the quality of the odor is a combination of reduced sulfur compounds like hydrogen sulfide, maybe touches of methyl mercaptan, we're not sure, also a very odorous compound, and a bit of ammonia and a bit of 2-butanal. So we've been able to characterize the malodors to a certain extent. And I think those are our main findings. Edmund, do you want to add anything, or should we just take questions? Oh, I'm not sure. You may still be on mute.
I have nothing to add to that. Thank you.
Oh, good. Okay. Russell or Keegan, do you want to add anything?
No, nothing to add. Happy to answer questions about where we sampled, but no, nothing to add specifically here.
Okay, and Keegan, same with you, sir?
Yes, I'd agree with that. If we have any specifics about what we sampled, how we sampled, or what the conditions were at the time, I'm happy to take those questions.
Okay, great. Well, then I guess if it's okay with you, I'd love to start talking with whoever wants to talk.
Okay, with that, then we'll take certainly questions, and we'll stay as long as we need to get all of your questions answered. Lynn? We would ask that everyone approach, as indicated earlier, the microphone, and that also puts you on the screen so that you can communicate with Dr. Green. Also, questions related specifically to the collection of the data at the landfill should be addressed to Trinity Consultants. Lynn, go ahead.
Thank you, Bill. Dr. Green.
Hi.
Can
How are
hear
you?
me?
Yeah, I can hear you. How are you?
How are you?
Good. I'm
My
good.
name is Lynn Doherty, and I've lived in the Fairmont Historic District for the last 32 years here in the great state of Tennessee. And we appreciate your work. Couple questions. The benzene levels, as you've indicated that, and I've read your report multiple times, but the benzene levels you've indicated that are showing from the Russell Bailey's report to you
Mhm.
are not enough to affect long-term health. What's your benchmark? Where are we, and what benchmark would you use to say that we reach a level that affects long-term health?
Thank you. Great question. We don't know for certain, but I'll give you my best judgment.
Thank you.
Benzene, before the federal government strictly regulated benzene, so we're talking 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, when men and women used to work around benzene in factories, the level that seemed to be dangerous to them started at about 1 to 10 parts per million, which is about 3 to 30 milligrams per cubic meter, which is about 30,000 micrograms per cubic meter. And what we're seeing here is about 100 times smaller than that. So if I'm doing the math in my head correctly, Edmund, I hope I am, correct me if I'm not, there's a pretty large margin of safety before we get to concentrations that we know are dangerous. What used to happen to men and women in factories before benzene was strictly regulated is their bone marrows would get poisoned by benzene. And this is very dangerous because you need your bone marrow functioning in order to make red blood cells and white blood cells. So people would get very sick. And some of them died outright from anemia, and others developed leukemia at excess rates. That hasn't happened in American factories since, I would say, the 1950s or 60s now. So there's a long way to go between these outdoor air levels, which are elevated and do represent contamination, and the kinds of levels that are quite harmful to our bone marrows. I think that's my judgment on that.
What effects would you believe would happen to folks without long-term health effects or short-term health effects breathing in benzene?
Yeah, good question. My own opinion is that the short-term health effects that folks are feeling, nausea, headaches, obviously quality of life issues, probably also nosebleeds. I'm a little unsure about that. Those kind of short-term effects I feel are mostly caused by the other compounds, the biodegradation products of the garbage. The benzene per se at these levels, I don't expect to have any health effects. Benzene doesn't smell bad. In fact, it smells kind of sweet. At these levels, you wouldn't smell it at all. So the benzene levels in the air, I don't think are doing anything to anyone. I think what people are experiencing are from the malodors and the bacterial biodegradation of the garbage. The benzene is mostly coming from gasoline, and I don't think it is contributing to folks' problems.
And you attribute those benzene levels to some underground gas tank that Bristol, Virginia has not taken care of. Is that my understanding?
Well, I don't know where the tank or tanks are, but yes, what I found was that, the landfill has to sample and analyze the wastewater essentially that it's creating before it sends it off to the Bristol, Tennessee wastewater facility. And they have a limit for how much benzene is allowed to be in that water. And they used to be in compliance for years. And then starting in about 2016, they stopped being in compliance. And if you look at the benzene concentrations in the water coming into the quarry, that's higher than the benzene concentrations in the water coming through the trash. So that's how we know that the source of benzene has to be somewhere outside the landfill and outside the quarry. I've been speaking with Mr. Miles Bartos of US EPA Region 3, and he tells me that the state is trying to track this down. I don't know where they stand in that. I hope they get to the bottom of it, but I'm frankly kind of shocked that the problem reared its head 5 years ago and no one noticed until Bristol, Tennessee asked us to take a look. I mean, that's not right.
How would they have noticed?
Well, they keep sampling it. I mean, we only plotted the data that they have. I don't completely understand it, but as I said, the landfill has an obligation because they're a customer of the Bristol, Tennessee wastewater facility. They have an obligation to sample their wastewater. I'm calling it wastewater, but it's a combination of water coming into the quarry and water going through the trash. So maybe wastewater is the wrong term, but it's going off to a wastewater treatment plant. And to my knowledge, all commercial customers of the wastewater treatment plant have to abide by certain limits of certain things. And so Bristol, Virginia's landfill operator, whoever is responsible for doing that sampling, has known for 5 years that there's too much benzene in the water that's sending off to Bristol, Tennessee. They've known it. They're getting fined because of it. But as far as I can tell, they're just kind of letting it happen. So I don't understand that. It makes no sense to me. As I said, the good news is nobody's drinking water is being contaminated. But imagine if folks had drinking water wells that were being affected by this plume, they wouldn't know. So I think it's unconscionable. I don't think it has harmed people's health, but that's only, frankly, because there aren't any drinking water wells there.
And can the benzene levels fluctuate higher and lower as time goes on?
Yeah, but they're only getting higher. I mean, yes, they can, but I'm telling you, that graph that we drew in our report, it's pretty much going up, not coming down.
You're in the Massachusetts area, is that my understanding?
Yes, sir. I'm in a little peninsula that juts back up into Boston Harbor, a place where, by the way, we know garbage.
A beautiful part of the world. I've been there. The benzene levels, let's say for Boston, how do they compare to Bristol, Tennessee?
Outdoor air benzene levels, probably about 1 or 2 micrograms per cubic meter in air. And the benzene levels in your neighborhoods, about 10 times higher than that.
And the population of Boston would be, do you know by chance?
It's a little short of 1 million in the metropolitan area.
And do you know the population of Bristol, Tennessee?
About 20,000, 25,000 maybe.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
As far as the odor's effect on people's animals, whether they be domestic animals or pets, is there some indication that what we're suffering through has an effect on those animals? And obviously body mass is much smaller.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it certainly can. As you know, dogs and cats, for example, and other animals have much more acute senses of smell than we do. And it certainly is true that cats in particular can be very adversely affected by strong odors, not only malodors, but sometimes strong odors that humans are fine with. And I think it is certainly possible that at least for some animals, if they are very aggravated by these smells, they might not want to eat, right? I mean, your sense of smell and your sense of taste are intimately connected. So yeah, I can imagine a situation in which some non-human mammals will be very bothered by this and will become emaciated, stop eating, stop drinking, and may pass away because of it. So it's not a direct toxicity, but it's certainly a very real thing. And I would imagine that non-human mammals could be much more highly affected than we humans. I mean, we humans aren't going to stop eating and drinking, even though we're very bothered by smells. But I think certainly there is evidence that certainly some other mammals will do exactly that.
Doctor, most of the folks in this room in some way, shape, or form have some type of gardens. do you have any suggestions to safeguard their produce, whether it be a tomato in a raised bed or a larger garden, or should that be a concern?
I don't think that should be a concern. My concern would be it's not very pleasant gardening when it stinks outside. But no, the noxious vapors and gases are noxious, but they're not going to deposit much. I would say the bigger problem is that some of these odors do tend to adsorb or either adsorb or absorb onto indoor building materials or fabrics. And I've spoken with some of your neighbors who report what I think is quite real phenomenon, which is, after a while it stinks indoors. And at first that doesn't seem to make much sense, but if some of you are like lifelong non-smokers, for example, and very sensitive to cigarette smoke odor, then you know what I'm talking about. You can walk into the room of a house where people smoke inside, and even if nobody's actively smoking, there are odors that just hit you and they're really unpleasant. Or like when you used to be able to smoke inside hotel rooms, for example, same thing. So I would say the secondary effects, if you will, are not on produce. They're on indoor environments, which can also be a reservoir, if you will, of some of these odors over time.
Doctor, do you know if Mr. Bailey took samples here in Bristol, Tennessee, as opposed to, you've referred to it as at the landfill? Were any samples taken here in our community in Tennessee?
US EPA certainly did, or more precisely, their contractors. Yes, they took samples on both sides of the state line in the neighborhoods. I think there are 9 places in toto. 2 or 3 are in Tennessee, and more of them are in Virginia. And their data, we haven't had a chance to look at all of it, but it's consistent with what you'd expect. That is to say, their data did find benzene in 2 or 3 neighborhoods in Bristol, Tennessee, higher levels in Bristol, Virginia. There's a neighborhood within, I think, I don't know, a couple thousand feet of the landfill where benzene is higher than anywhere on the Tennessee side. But certainly on the Tennessee side, yes, US EPA did take samples there, and Virginia DEQ did as well. But Mr. Bailey, his focus was the landfill itself, because we wanted to get to the source. We wanted to see what on the landfill was creating odors. And so, for example, we learned that it's not the compost heaps. We learned that the serious odors on the landfill are coming from the leachate collection system, which is malfunctioning and should be fixed, should have been fixed a while ago. The odors are coming from these hot wells, which is where the subsurface smoldering reactions going on. Let's see, there was one other odorous place, which I'm blanking on at the moment, but there were 3 sources on the landfill that were clearly odorous, but the composting was not a source of odors. And 1 or 2 other places. Russell, do you remember, or Keegan?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, now.
Okay, great. So what we looked at is the odors were kind of variable depending on where we were at. The most intense overall odors were down in the hot well area. After that, the active landfill, was the second most, or perhaps the leachate tank. They had kind of different characters. So with the different kinds of odors, it's kind of hard to say exactly which was stronger. But the hot wells, the leachate tank, and the existing, the active landfill were the most intense areas.
So
I think you said close to the chimney areas, that it's the areas on both sides where there's emissions clearly visible.
I'm sorry, what was the term, hot belt or hot melt?
Hot wells. It's the,
Hot well.
yeah, it's the places, there are 5 or 6 of them, and they represent, they are hot because deep down in the pile of trash, there's something going on. It's not exactly a fire. It's kind of a smoldering something. This can be a problem at landfills. I mean, it doesn't happen all the time, but it's not unprecedented either. Unlike the leachate collection system, which should have been fixed a long time ago, and it's just plumbing. Trying to fix a smoldering, trying to put out a smoldering reaction that's, you know, let's say 100 feet down into a heap of garbage and dirt, turns out to be not easy to fix. And it has probably caused some subsidence, meaning that the landfill has not exactly a sinkhole, that's not the right thing, but there are fissures, for lack of a better term, because of this smoldering reaction, apparently, and that's allowing gases to escape. I mean, one thing that's unfortunate and unusual about this landfill is in a properly operating landfill, you're always going to have some escape of gases. That's inevitable. But somewhere around 80%, 85% of the gas in a well-run landfill is captured and sent to either a flare or some engines or some turbines. I mean, the gas has, you know, got a lot of methane in it, and you burn it to make energy and to get rid of it. At this landfill, because of these subsidence and other problems, a lot of the gas is just escaping out into the atmosphere. And that's a major reason that you have such an odor problem in both Bristol cities. There's not nearly as much capture of gas as there ought to be. So it's a combination of the quality of the gas is probably not all that different from an ordinary landfill, but there's much more escaping than there ought to be. And then separately, the leachate collection system is malfunctioning. So those are, and there's this smoldering reaction going on underground. So there are really 3 problems. And all 3 of those problems are the reasons that your neighborhoods are being, well, trespassed upon, for lack of a better term.
Doctor, just one follow-up, so I'm sure, because I get confused. This issue with what you opine or must be underground gas tanks, your opinion is that Bristol, Virginia knew or should have known for approximately 5 years that this was occurring and didn't report it?
Well, they reported it to somebody because they keep getting fined by the wastewater treatment plant, but they didn't apparently report it to the state or the feds. Now, I don't know if they're supposed to. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I don't run a landfill. But it's hard for me to believe that someone shouldn't have told somebody.
Thank you. Appreciate your work.
Likewise, thank you.
Other questions? Yeah, Mike.
Good evening, Dr. Green and the other guests. I appreciate you coming here. My name is Mike Givney. I live up on Taylor Street by the First Presbyterian Church. Or at least I did until Thanksgiving, when my wife and I had to evacuate, and we're now living in a camper in Carter County due to the effects on her fibromyalgia from the toxins. I have a couple questions for you. One related to the assessment, and then one on the testing.
Yes, sir.
In the 2013 data set from the Bridgeton landfill, referenced by the CRET report, which you then referenced in your report, dioxins were detected on site downwind and upwind from the landfill. I understand that dioxin testing can be performed using either air or soil methods. And I was wondering, why was dioxin testing excluded from the tests ordered as part of this public health assessment?
Yeah, very good question. Thank you. Yes, it is certainly true that you can sample for dioxins, and we could have done it. It was my judgment that what we should do is a better test, which is looking for polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. Because if there's a fire going on, yes, you're going to make a tiny bit of dioxins and furans, but what you're going to make in abundance are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, you know, the stuff that makes charcoal broiled steak taste good, and it's also bad for you. So if you're looking for markers of fire, you don't look for dioxins and furans. I mean, that's a tiny, tiny, tiny reaction. There's minuscule amounts. You look for either elemental carbon, soot, or which we didn't look for, or you look for the organic compounds, which are both toxic and are reflective of an underground fire, and that's polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And we did do that. We asked Russell and Keegan to make sure to, you know, specify that when they sent it off to the laboratory, and we didn't find much. That's why, as I said, it's more of a smoldering thing than an outright fire. I think in Bridgeton, I mean, you're right, that's a terrible mess. That's a landfill that's been a problem for even longer than the Bristol, Virginia one has been a problem. In the Bridgeton landfill, it's actually a metal fire, aluminum dross. So it's a very different kind of problem there. And even so, in my recollection, correct me if I'm wrong, but my recollection is the Missouri Department of Natural Resources, although they did find dioxins and furans in ambient air, it was, as you correctly said, upwind and downwind and below health standards. So that's why we didn't bother. It was our belief, and continues to be my belief, that if we saw high levels of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, that would be important from a health point of view. And that would also signal that the smoldering was actually an outright fire, but we didn't find that.
Thank you very much.
Is that helpful?
Yeah, that does answer my question. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
And then as far as the testing goes, and I think Dr. Crouch mentioned this, but it wasn't, I didn't understand it, or I couldn't hear what he said. We know that in our landfill, when the method 13A tests for PAHs were done on the surface of the landfill, they were done near the hot wells. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So we also have on this landfill several areas along the sidewalls that Bristol, Virginia has termed chimneys, but are actual fissures, like I believe you spoke of them earlier. And
Yeah.
these fissures are visually emitting gases. You can actually see them. They've been videotaped, and they vent freely into our homes. And I was wondering why, when you use the method 13As for PAHs, why they weren't done over or very close to these fissures in the surface of the landfill.
I'll try to answer it, but then I'm happy to let Russell or Keegan or Edmund answer it as well. I'm not, the fissures are a problem, no question. They're letting a lot of vapors escape. my sense is that what you see is mostly vapors, and in particular water vapor. I don't think that that is smoke per se. The hot wells are hot because that's closest to the smoldering. So we asked Russell and Keegan to sample for polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons as close to the smoldering as they could get. And that's what the hot wells are. What's coming out of the fissures, as I said, I think are vapors, and I think you see it as water vapor under certain conditions. I mean, I don't know, Russell or Keegan or Edmund, do you want to add to that or contradict me or?
Sure, I can add in briefly. So we tested. It was a different test for 13A, and because the target was PAHs that would come from combustion, and because of the elevated temperatures, that was a location that we ran that test, which was a longer test. It was not terribly far away from the chimney, as it's called, on the southeast wall. It was within a couple hundred feet of that chimney, a little bit higher. We did sample. We performed the other tests right next to that location, and you could see on that chimney. Went there first in the morning. You could see a little bit of gases kind of pooled down in that low spot. They had dissipated a little bit later in that day. And like you said, there was another location on the west wall, roughly middle north to south, where you saw vapors coming up near where we understand the leachate collection location under it is there. But like Dr. Green said, the focus was on measuring PAHs from partial potential combustion in the hot well area itself. And that was probably within a couple hundred feet or in that range of that south chimney. But anyway, I'm not sure that answers your question any better, but that's what I would add to it.
Thank you. I guess my concern was with the wells being capped and drawing to either the flare or up to Ingenco. I wasn't sure if the amount of PAHs that you would have found there would have been the same if they were by the chimney or the fissures in the well or in the landfill surface. But thank you for that answer. I appreciate it. And then
you might like to know that at the time we planned the sampling, we weren't aware of the chimney on the west side of the landfill. So we only knew about the one on the east side, and there was a sample taken there for TO15 sample there just to see what it was like. Also, you're mentioning fissures, but the emissions on the west side, at least, appear to be coming from the gap between the liner and the rock wall of the quarry. So it may not be a real fissure in the material in the landfill, in the waste. It may be material escaping into that small gap. There's a small gap left there in order to let the water going into the landfill drain down to the bottom where it can be collected. That's called the gradient water. And the same may be true on the east. We just don't know. I just don't know, certainly. Maybe they do on the landfill. I don't know.
So you feel there are fugitive gases running up that quarry wall then?
It appears that the landfill gas is escaping into that gap there. It's not, I mean, it's a fabric. It's not a pure gap, it's a fabric, but it allows water to flow down it, and it will allow gases to flow through it as well.
Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate that. And then one last question, if I may, for Dr. Green. Screening levels. I had a question about those, and they're, if I remember correctly, they're based on individual chemicals that are studied in isolation and not mixtures of chemicals with regards to health effects. So my question is it possible that when you combine exposure to these chemicals, could that cause adverse health risks over time? Instead of it being single chemicals that we're looking at, could the combination of the chemicals that you found cause these any adverse health effects?
Yeah, it's a good question, and you're quite right. Except for one aspect. We're never exposed to individual chemicals. I mean, that's just not a thing. And so, for example, we know a lot about exposures to benzene, but of course, the men and women whose health was destroyed by benzene, they were also living in the world. I mean, they were exposed to mixtures of everything. So while you're certainly right that when you rely on animal experiments, you do tend to load up the animal with one chemical at a time. But when we're relying on data from human observations, as we do for benzene, for example, those are free living people who happen to work around a lot of benzene, but also live, commute to work and all the rest of it. So your premise is correct, but not entirely so. Now, I will say that landfill gas has been fairly well characterized. US EPA pretty strictly regulates or tries to regulate solid waste landfills. And US EPA has spent tens of millions of dollars studying the quality of landfill gas. There's a lot of data on what's in landfill gas, and it's of course a mixture of a lot of things. So landfill gas is pretty well characterized. But you're certainly right that this is a noxious mixture, and it's a noxious mixture of landfill gas, which is fairly well understood, plus everything else we're exposed to, viruses, bacteria, pollution from other sources. So we're always exposed to mixtures. I don't think the situation in Bristol is that different from the situation that all of us experience, though. We're always exposed to literally thousands and thousands of things, from emissions from cars and trucks and furnaces, and in your case, unfortunately, also a stinky landfill.
Okay, thank you, doctors and the gentleman from Trinity. I appreciate your insight.
Thank you.
Mike, other questions? Up, Sam.
Hello, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you, sir?
Doing well, and thank you very much for your work, and thanks to the city for taking this step. One, you mentioned in the report that the EPA was going to do continued testing, and you may be aware of it already. They did drop those results, and for example, like on Sparkling Brook Drive, actually near where I live, like the mercaptan levels were measured between 0.1 and 0.3 parts per million, which is pretty stinky, but I'm sure you're going to be looking at that. So some of them are mercaptans and other things. We started to get some data on that if you haven't looked at that already. Just wanted to mention that. So my big thing is I have really more of an observation and wanted a reaction from you about that, if that's all right. You mentioned on page 20 of the report that, while that the malodors themselves don't constitute hazardous condition that can harm people's quality of life. And I know that you want to just stick with like health effects, is it going to kill us? But I thought that was like the biggest understatement in the whole report, because when I read the Bridgeton report that ATSDR put together with the Missouri Department of Health, they actually spent many pages on like mental health impacts and things of that nature, and how mental health is health, how those impacts can affect quality of life. And I was just kind of wondering if you had plans to sort of flesh out the quality of life question for us, how serious that is, because in my case, like last night, I was woken up by the gases and did not get a full amount of sleep. And I'm not a very, I can be grumpy if I don't get all of my sleep. But if you do that day after day, week after week, that can really add up. So all of that to say, you know, is there more that could be said in this report about the quality of life impacts along the lines of what we've seen from ATSDR and other agencies?
Sure. I mean, I take your point. Look, I feel horrible about the situation that you all are living with. I mean, I feel horrible. I wish that there were a way to just shut it off tomorrow, or for that matter, last year or the year before. I don't know what more I can say that you don't already know, though. I mean, you know that it disrupts your sleep. It disrupts your ability to have a good time in the backyard. It can affect the quality the quality of air inside your house. I mean, you know these things. My job as a chemist and toxicologist is to tell you something you don't know. So I'm not sure what else I could say. I mean, it is horrible and I feel terrible, and I hope and imagine that the folks who own and operate the landfill feel horrible too. They ought to feel horrible. They made a mess and they don't know how to operate it, and they don't know how to fix it. It's a damn shame. But I'm a chemist and a toxicologist, and so my focus is things like, are you at excess risk of getting diseases? Now, there's an overlap. I take your point, sir, and you are 100% correct. Mental health is physical health. There's no question. There's no question. But I don't know what to do with that. It's true, but I don't have any particular expertise in that, not as a chemist and not as a toxicologist. I think the overlap, and it's a tricky one, into toxicology is, as I said, you know, there's some things that folks are feeling, and I honestly don't know. I just don't know whether it's from the landfill. And nosebleeds is the example I mentioned in passing. I don't know whether the chemicals, whether the vapors and gases coming into your neighborhoods can or cannot cause nosebleeds. I just do not know. But I'm willing to believe that it's possible, especially for what it's worth, because of the food waste that I mentioned before, could be generating something that could be causing allergies, which could, you know, result in upper respiratory tract reactions, which could cause you nosebleeds. But I don't know. I mean, the science, you know, as a scientist, there's only so far I can go here. So I take your point, but I'm not sure what I could write that you don't already know in that regard.
Thank you. And I just have one final question, and it's about the benzene source. And I know that that's still being investigated. You know, a recent development, I was at the Bristol, Virginia Council meeting last night, and they were talking about sending the divers down, and it was in their paper today. They are inspecting the integrity of the wet wells and that sort of thing. And in the comments that the city manager in Virginia made, he said something about they were unclear about the integrity of several things down there. And the mention was made about the possibility of an integrity problem with the weir wall down there, I believe. Yeah, how certain are you that, I mean, that you feel that the benzene is coming from an outside plume rather than maybe like material defects in the landfill itself, and it could be coming from the leachate water, and it is in fact the collection system so compromised you have mixtures, and with that I'll sit down. Thank you.
It's a good question. I think there are at least two lines of evidence that suggest that most of the benzene is coming into the quarry. The first is the steepness of the increase. You know, if this were benzene just coming from rainfall falling through garbage, you'd expect fluctuations. You might expect a little increase from time to time, a little decrease from time to time. But this thing is going straight up. over the last 5 years. That doesn't look like leachate to me. That's the first thing. The pattern's wrong. The second thing is we do have separate samples of water coming into the quarry and water going through the garbage. We do have separate samples. And the samples of the water coming into the quarry have more benzene in them. So there's clearly an exterior source. I don't know what it is. As I said, people are trying to figure it out, but there's no question that it is coming into the quarry and then mixing with the leachate. There's a little bit of benzene in the leachate, but it's not much until it mixes.
Other questions? You're good. You're good.
Hi, Dr. Green. My name is Tina Hogue, and I live on Taylor Street in Bristol, Tennessee.
Hi.
My question for you is, in your professional assessment, has sufficient air and water testing been performed to determine short and long-term health effects? And a follow-up to that is, if not, what additional testing would you recommend?
Very good question. Well, I'm not completely sure. US EPA is coming back again to try to figure out the benzene thing a little bit more. They do, the agency, Region 3, does want to get more of a handle on the benzene situation. So they're coming back. I don't know whether they're fixing to do any additional sampling or not. They certainly could be. I know they're bringing Summa canisters, which means you can just, collect a bunch of stuff. And I've actually been talking with Miles Bartos of US EPA Region 3 about what else he might look for when he comes back. Mercaptans were mentioned by the gentleman before. I don't think that the existing data are actually all that reliable on mercaptans. And I am fixing to ask Mr. Bartos to do more mercaptan sampling. The data that we have so far are from monitors that aren't really sensitive enough to get at the question of the reduced sulfuric compounds, except for hydrogen sulfide. So there are going to be additional data collected. In terms of the water, since no one's drinking the water, it's important to find the benzene leak, but I don't think it's important from the public health point of view, except to the extent that some of that water is ultimately ending up creating a benzene problem in the air. So there are going to be additional data, but I would say we have enough data already to have a pretty good sense of what's happening. There is more benzene in the air than there ought to be, but it's not a huge amount relative, again, to what air quality used to be in the 1960s in the United States. There is a little more acrolein. It's another volatile organic compound, but we're not sure that that's a problem. And in any event, it doesn't seem to be coming from the landfill. So I do think that in terms of air quality, we have a good handle on it. What we don't have a good handle on is, how to make the problem resolve it, how to get the problem resolved. That's the big need now, is how to fix the problem with the leachate collection, how to try to fix or smother the smoldering, how to try to get more gas going into either the flare or the engines and stopping it from going out into the atmosphere. So the problems are really engineering problems. I don't think they're problems of lack of data at this point.
Other questions? Yes. Yeah. Just come to the podium. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Green. Thank you, council, for putting this together. I'm Chase Mitchell. I live, oops, just hold it. I live a block over here away on Taylor Street, like a lot of folks who are here tonight. I just wanted to make an observation and ask a question related. You've probably heard the descriptions from folks about how horrible this is. I know you understand it. You've expressed your sympathies, and we thank you for your work and those sentiments. Last night, as some of you guys probably can attest in this room, was no hyperbole or exaggeration, maybe the worst night we've had on Taylor Street. I'm the kind of person where I can fall asleep in less than 10 minutes when my head hits the pillow, if it's normal circumstances. And I go to bed like a 75-year-old about 9 o'clock. And I did not fall asleep until 4 a.m. last night.
Oh, gosh.
We live in a 1,200 square foot small home, new windows, sealed, with Gorilla Glue duct tape, 4 air purifiers. And I would liken laying in our bed, my wife and I, to a bathtub full of paint thinner right beside my bed. And so my question is, I know you're doing the science and reading the data, but how you made the distinction between, like, benzene doesn't smell bad, but it can be potentially harmful. The levels are low, not harmful. I get that. But if the other ones are not high enough to create health problems, what does constitute the federal government's or EPA's definition of harmful? As Sam mentioned, mental health is certainly affected, but beyond that, I guess my question is, what does it take? And I know I'm not completely educated on that, and that's my fault, but I'm just curious from your perspective.
Yeah, look, it's an excellent question. I think I can offer the following. And this is going to sound a little indirect. You know, there's a concept of environmental injustice, and folks usually mean it in a racial sense. They usually mean that industrial zoning is such that, you know, the lousy factories went on the black and brown side of the railroad tracks. But there's another aspect to environmental injustice. And that is what you all are experiencing. It's not racial. It's not economic. It's the fact that it is unjust to pollute someone's environment. It's just not right. So you all are the victims of an environmental injustice. Now, I don't know what to do about that, but that is my view of it. And at least at the federal government level, and I know in the state of Virginia and probably in the state of Tennessee, but certainly in the state of Virginia, there is an Environmental Justice Act. It was passed a year or two ago. It's called VJ, the Virginia Environmental Justice Act. And it was passed because the Virginia legislature, and again, maybe it's a similar thing in Tennessee, the Virginia legislature recognized and wanted to codify that it is illegal to perpetrate an environmental injustice on a community. And whether they're black or brown or white, whether they're rich or poor, environmental conditions that are putrid are by definition unjust. And it's especially, of course, the case that if the tipping fees are all going to Bristol, Virginia, but the odors are being distributed to Bristol, Tennessee, well, that's another kick in the pants, isn't it? So I don't know, maybe there's something to that.
Joel, come on up.
Good evening. Dr. Green, I've got one question here for you. And it's pretty simple, I think, pretty basic. Based on the currently available data, are you able to say with certainty that our community will not suffer long-term health effects from the Bristol, Virginia landfill?
No. but can't say anything with certainty. No, look, I'm giving you my best judgment. That's all I can do. I know a lot about benzene. I actually wrote a book about it. I know a lot about landfill gas. I know a lot about air quality. I'm giving you my judgment. I'm also thinking from first principles. Look, the fact is that your landfill is exceptionally poorly run. It is exceptionally smelly. There is an exceptionally poor way of capturing the gas, like it's not being captured. But this is much, much more of a noxious problem than a toxic problem, in my judgment. Can I be 100% sure? Of course not. I'd be a fool to say otherwise. But I believe that if and when the problems are solved, and it's going to take months, maybe years, I believe that there will not be long-lasting health effects from this. I believe that if any of you left and moved to another city or state or country, that other than bad memories, you'd be fine. I do not believe that this landfill is causing you long-term harm. That is my belief. That's my judgment. Can I say it with 100% certainty? I'd be an idiot to do that.
All right, thank you. And I had one more question too, based on this leaking underground gasoline tank. So over 5 years with these levels of benzene, how large would these tanks have to be?
Oh, that's a good question. I have no idea. Edmund, I'm going to throw that one to you. You don't know either.
No, I couldn't unmute myself. I calculated how much benzene was going into the landfill based on the measurements in the available measurements to me on the wastewater going to the wastewater treatment plant. And it came to about 3 grams a year, I think it was. Not very much. So you wouldn't have to have huge tanks, underground storage tanks, if that is what it is. But it's certainly more than you would expect normally from leaking from a small leak in a small tank. But really, we can't say how much because we've just got no idea.
Okay, thank you. I have one more here. So when you narrow down this benzene to an outside source, it's known here that they have had problems with their leachate and gradient pumping systems for a long time, and basically using just one pump for each. So I'm not sure how you can say with certainty that the benzene is coming from an outside source if the source is contaminated with both gradient and leachate. Can you explain how you came to that conclusion?
Edmund, I'm giving that one to you too.
Yeah. There is mixing between the leachate and the gradient water. Yes, but you can get samples which are reasonably more of one than the other. And when you do that, you find the gradient, the measurements in the gradient water seem to be certainly higher than in the leachate water, although it varies a bit. There's also a third sampling point in the landfill, and that's called the witness zone between the leachate collection system and the gradient water collection system. And that's that again can get contaminated from either, and it's only recently, more recently, been starting to see benzene in that, which again suggests somewhat, I think, that it's more likely the gradient water that is the main contaminant here. So I think the leachate water is getting the benzene from the gradient water. But again, we don't know what's going on at the bottom of that landfill. So we can't be absolutely certain.
Right, thank you.
Hello, my name's George Link. I live in Sullivan County. My parents live on Georgia Avenue, so I'm kind of representing them. Good evening.
Hi, how are you?
I appreciate you all coming out to explain all this. I've been the guy who's been running around the neighborhoods doing independent air testing, and I've been using the colorimetric gas system, the four-way gas meter and bump cylinders, and I've been dragging air to the GC in my office. And we have a lot of your results line up with mine, but so with that all aside, I want to have more human questions for you.
Okay.
For a small college town with an incredibly light industry, would you concur that the air quality is poor here for what it is?
Absolutely.
All right. And if that air were to intrude into your home within the span of 2 months, I would presume you would not be pleased and you wouldn't tolerate it.
Correct.
All right. I think we're on the same page here then. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Other questions?
Yes, my name is Gina Wine, and I'm a resident of Bristol, Tennessee. I've been a resident of Bristol since I was 13 years old. And for all that time, I always had very good health up until about 6 years ago when I moved to a neighborhood that is a half a mile from the landfill. And you can hear in my voice, which sounds like a nervous, rattly voice, the sound of chemical asthma. I did not have this asthma prior to moving to that residence. I was diagnosed with it within 8 months of moving there. I've had to change careers. I'm a nurse. I worked in the operating room and labor and delivery for 14 years and had to change my career because of this form of asthma. I was hospitalized for 4 days with this and nearly died. My physicians are unable to explain where and how it came from. Most asthmas are caused by eosinophils, and so far, they have not been able to find any eosinophils in me. They did many, many allergy tests, and so far have only been able to find out that I'm allergic to dust mites. So I do believe that the long-term effects of what this is causing are still to be discovered, because I was very healthy and fine before moving to this neighborhood 6 years ago. I'm not sure what can be done. My doctors, like I said, are baffled. They've treated me with some of the most well-known treatments that there are for asthma, and so far my asthma responds to none of them. When I'm at work, my coworkers can't wear perfume, they can't use lotion, and they have to be careful about the deodorants that they use because they could literally kill me. And so I hope that we pay a little more attention to the possibility that the health effects of this are far from discovered at this time. Thank you.
Are there other questions for Dr. Green or other panelists? Yes.
Dr. Green, thank you, City Council. And I want to thank Virginia side City Council for recognizing that we have a problem, okay? But I'm gonna go back about 50 years right here. I was raised in Kingtown as a kid. Got married, been on Shakespeare Road for 38 years. My wife's family has been up on Shakespeare Road for 80+ years. I remember number 2 landfill was nothing but a farmland. I hauled stone and stuff out of the old rock quarry back in the late 70s, all the way through the 80s, part of the 90s. You was talking about an outside source on a gasoline leak, diesel fuel, whatever. I don't reckon that I know of anything on the outside part of it other than the quarry. They had a asphalt plant in there, plus they had their own garage, and there was a little construction company right when you go into the quarry. I'm not saying no names or anything like that, but the city knowed about all this when they bought this piece of property 25 years ago, whatever it's been. And here again, no names again. But the city council back then knowed exactly what they was buying. The test wasn't done properly. We signed a petition 20-some years ago not to put this place there. I experienced landfill number 2. I remember when it was a farmland. I played over there, all the way over through Meadowbrook, all around there, my wife's family and everything. We put up with the mud, the dust, the noise, the truck traffic, nothing compared to what we're going through right now. It sucks. It absolutely sucks on both sides of the state. This is a shame. I know the city council that we have over there now didn't create this mess, but they stepped in place to protect us. Well, it's not done too good. Now we recognize that we have a problem. But I like to go back to the outside source of the gasoline, benzene. There's no outside source. How far can this stuff travel? We don't have no other big companies, except for the company who was in there on the landfill, the asphalt plant, and the other little construction company. Back in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, how much stuff was just put in the ground, never paid no attention to? That's about all I have to say. I like to see what you have to say on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me say first, before I address your comments, to the nurse who spoke just before you, I'm very, very sorry. Very, very sorry to hear about your health problems. And I very much hope that someone gets to the bottom of it and that you get the relief that you need. I'm very sorry to hear it. Let's see, to the gentleman who's speaking now. I don't know where the benzene's coming from, but there's just no way it's coming from inside the landfill. Doesn't make any sense. I assume there's a gas station somewhere in the area. I mean, all it takes is one leaking underground storage tank. That's all it takes. And by the way, it could be miles and miles away.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know where it is. I don't know what it is, but it's not inside the landfill. That's not the way the pattern looks. It's coming into the landfill through the fissures in the quarry. I'm not sure, frankly, that it matters, really. I mean, what matters for you all is it's getting out into your air. It doesn't really matter whether it's coming from inside the landfill or outside the landfill. The truth is, it's, you know, what's happening and what's causing the pollution is the benzene in this water. You know, I've looked at a lot of landfill leachates, and you just don't see benzene levels being low for years and years, and then all of a sudden shooting up to the sky, you know, sample after sample over a 5-year period. The pattern is clearly not consistent with it being inside the landfill, but in the final analysis, I'm not sure it matters.
Okay. Can I ask something else here? There
Yes, sir.
you said inside the landfill. What about on the outskirts of the landfill? where the
Sure.
rock quarry used to be, where the construction company used to be. There used to be a little settlement pond right there at the scales. The scales are still at the same place. The settlement pond is at the same place. Like I said, we played in the creeks below there in Kingtown. Could this gas situation on the benzene be on the outside of the property, not inside the hole?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay, that's kind of, because my recognition that there is nothing else around there. It's all that used to be farmland. The closest store is out there on King Mill Pike in Airport Road. And it's been there for years and years, but I wouldn't think that's one of the low spots right there. The rock quarry and where I live is probably one of the highest spots in our area, other than over in Meadowbrook area. But that's all I have to say. Thank you so much for speaking for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions? Yes, come up. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Court Nutter. I've lived in Bristol, Tennessee for about 27 years. First, let me thank the city council for doing this and all who are involved. My question is, the people who are experiencing symptoms like nosebleeds and headaches 5 to 7 times a week,
Yeah.
what is there something you can tell us that would maybe stop that, and the second part of that is, how long is this gonna, go on, or should, the citizens that can move, should we?
Yeah, good questions. I don't think it's going to be a short-term fix. So let's separate it into sort of its 3 component parts. It ought to be relatively easy to do the plumbing to fix the pump and other issues surrounding the leachate. So the bad odors that are being generated because leachate, instead of being essentially confined into pipes, is partially being exposed to the atmosphere. That problem ought to be relatively easy to fix and ought to be fixable on the scale of weeks to months. So, good, sir, yes.
Sorry, is that what is causing people's headaches and nosebleeds?
I don't know. It's one thing that, I mean, the smell of leachate is disgusting. It's disgusting. So if that leachate is properly managed, and again, it's just plumbing, the smells from that area should diminish, within days to weeks of it being fixed. So that part's the easy part. I don't know how much that's going to help, but it's certainly going to help some. The smells associated with the fugitive gases, because there's smoldering going on and the landfill operators don't have a handle on that. That's a much tougher problem to solve. It's not insolvable, but it takes both expertise and resources. And those may be in relatively short supply. I do know that the city has appealed to the state and the feds. So maybe the cavalry is coming. I hope so. I mean, with resources and expertise, it is fixable, but putting out a subterranean smoldering thing, whatever it is a technically very difficult thing to do. It's much harder than just some plumbing. So I think there's a short-term fix that ought to happen in, let's say, a couple months. There's a longer-term fix, which will probably take at least a year, maybe more. I I don't know what to do about it. I mean, by which there's no solution for this. I mean, malodors are malodors. And if you're sensitized to them, you're sensitized to them. And it's a damn shame. It's a little bit like trying to unscramble an egg. So in the long term, you know, those of you who want to stick around, I mean, if the feds and or the Commonwealth of Virginia coughs up the money and the expertise, yeah, it's fixable. But it's going to take a while and it's not going to be straightforward.
Thank you.
Are there?
Good evening, Dr. Green. I'm Lee Powers. We've met before and we really appreciate your being here this evening. Given the fact that this is not going to be an immediate fix, as you've said, and given the fact that earlier you mentioned the benzene levels have continued to rise, from a toxicological perspective, how should we move forward as far as monitoring air quality? Should we rely on BDEQ and the EPA, or would it be incumbent on us to take on monitoring air quality on our own to be sure that our residents have a clear understanding moving forward as to exactly what the air quality is, for two reasons. Number one, to know that, to reassure everyone that they're not in harm's way with this. And if the benzene levels do escalate, or the substance that you said was more concerning than the dioxins or some of these other toxins, how should we move forward as far as measuring our air quality and to reassure our community?
Yeah, hi, nice to see you again. Great question. I gotta say, I haven't thought about it. It is a good idea. It is a good idea to have some kind of not continuous monitoring, but frequent monitoring. It's a good idea. I need to think a little bit about how one would best do it. And frankly, I would ask Russell Bailey, because he's more of an expert in this than I am. But I think it's a fine idea. You know, when things are in non-compliance, you often increase the sampling. At a minimum, using benzene as a marker, there certainly could and should be more frequent sampling. I honestly haven't thought about it, but I guess I would pledge to you that after this meeting, maybe Russell and I and Edmund and Keegan will put our heads together. Unless, Russell, you have something to say off the top of your head, and propose a sampling plan that would be sensible without costing the earth, and provide the kind of assurance that you're asking for. I think it's a great idea. Russell, do you have thought on that, or should we think about it for a while?
I think we'll need to discuss it a little more and figure out just figure out the scope and the objectives, just like when we did the sampling on the site. So, but I think we can certainly do that and talk through it and come up with some options that could be considered for it.
Okay.
And just one other thought, not knowing exactly when this is going to be resolved or how it's going to be resolved, and that there's a timing issue here. Is your thought that these toxins, gases could very well continue to increase over a period of time to the point where we are in a more dangerous situation?
Well, obviously, I hope not, but that's why your idea is such a good one. You know, as I've said, I don't understand why this has been building for 5 years and no one's bothered to even plot the data like we did. You know, this is not rocket science.
I think-
So, yeah,
I think it would be unfortunate, given the efforts that have gone into all of this to date, for us to not to continue to plot the toxins in the gases as to their different levels and as to their locations. So I appreciate your insights, and it's something that we as a council can certainly continue to discuss. Thank you.
thank you.
Other question, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Green. My name's John Link, and I want to thank Bristol City Council and Mr. Sora and everybody for being here. I moved here in 1988 in order to raise my children and give them a good environment. And I love Bristol. And if one thing good has come out of all this mess, is I've met such wonderful people and neighbors, and I've seen a community come together. I can sit here and tell you how my wife and my mother-in-law and myself and how we're suffering. We're all suffering tremendously. I just want to ask, and this, I'm not asking you for a legal opinion or anything like that. If you were a resident and you were living here, we know that there's still a ton of work that needs to be done on the landfill, but would you, if you lived here, would you still allow trash to be coming in? Ultimately, we need to close this and cap this. And I think most would agree with me, but it's going to need to be managed for years and years after. Thank you.
Well, if I lived there, I'd be hopping mad. That's for sure. You know, the closure thing's a tricky thing because it does take resources and expertise to fix the problem. I mean, stopping taking trash is not going to fix the problem. So that's the tricky thing. I mean, the city, I understand, is millions and millions of dollars in debt, but it is making revenue by collecting garbage. So I don't know. I would have, I guess I would have very mixed feelings if I were living there on that question. It's much more important to fix it than to close it. I guess that would be that is my feeling. I can certainly appreciate that many of you are hopping mad that Bristol, Virginia keeps taking garbage and keeps creating a nuisance. I mean, that does not seem fair, does it?
Sam?
I'm sorry, I'm double dipping. I apologize. Just one question. You've mentioned now 3 times it doesn't fit the pattern with the benzene, you know, why it would just start escalating for 5 years. And there was no indication before. Just a question, did you all consider the possibility that maybe the data previous to 5 years is not accurate? I mean, Bristol, Virginia Council's on the record as saying that they had an employee that was not properly filling out the paperwork on a lot of these reports. And we also had a BVU, which is good now, but 5 years ago, how many members were brought up on federal charges for corruption? I mean, I'm just saying, did you all consider the possibility that maybe the data set is compromised? Thank you.
Good question. I did not consider that. Edmund, any thoughts?
No, we didn't really consider that. It looks a bit unlikely just looking at the data. Why would it go up slowly? You would expect it to, I mean, not slowly, but it had a slope to it. If that had been true, then you would expect a steep, not a steep, but a sharp step function. It would go up instantly to where it is now from some low number before. if somebody suddenly started doing it right and they had been faking it before, you would get a step change, and that doesn't happen. So no, we didn't consider it. We didn't even know about any problems in measurement before.
Joel, I think you had a question.
All right, Dr. Green, you talk about hopping mad, and yes, we are. So we have a mismanaged landfill in a limestone quarry with a underground fire, high levels of benzene and fugitive emissions. So to mitigate the many issues with this landfill, how would you do that and continue intake? How is that even possible? I know in Bridgeton, Missouri, that was not possible. They put a cap and a geomembrane cover over that and captured these emissions. How would that work here in Bristol?
Well, I'm not a landfill engineer, but the working face of the landfill isn't the problem. I mean, it's one of the few things about the landfill that isn't a problem. I mean, as I said, when the leachate collection system gets properly plumbed, that's going to help a lot. And that's got nothing to do with active taking of garbage. The smoldering wells are not at the working face of the landfill either. So they are separate places. I mean, you certainly could, lay down in front of the trash trucks and prevent them from coming in, but it's not going to help. So I'm not sure why you would do it.
Okay. Didn't really answer the question though. So you're saying that the cover on this landfill right now is sufficient, that the working face is fine, and that these fugitive emissions coming from fissures that have opened up because of this subsurface fire are not a problem? They can just fill those in and we'll be good?
Oh gosh, if you thought I was saying that, I must not have been communicating very well.
I'm kind of slow, and as we talk, this room is filling up with these non-hazardous gases. So it makes it a little difficult to think.
I'm only trying to say that this is not like a factory where if you stop the mill, the emissions stop. I mean,
I understand that, but how do you mitigate these fugitive emissions while you still got trucks driving in there and dumping trash on top of it? It's like,
because the current garbage is not what's causing the stink.
okay.
I mean, that's not the problem. The problem is the old garbage. The problem is the old garbage that, and I don't know, by the way, whether it's on fire or just smoldering or just an exothermic reaction, but in any event, that's garbage that's 100 feet down. I don't know how old that is, but it's not yesterday's trash.
I understand.
Yeah, I mean,
Yesterday's trash in 20 years is going to be that old trash.
oh, absolutely, sir. No, look, no question. This landfill needs to be fixed and then closed. It does not need to be closed and then fixed.
Okay. I guess I don't understand that process, how you can do that, how you can fix it before you close it. It doesn't make sense, because
Well,
to
you
me,
need
stopping the intake is the first thing that you would do.
no. The current garbage isn't the problem. The problem is the mismanagement of the leachate. And the problem is the incomplete capture of the gases. The gases are created by older garbage, not yesterday's trash. No, what needs to happen is the gas capture system has to be greatly improved. The leachate capture system has to be greatly improved. And attempts need to be made to understand what the subsurface reaction is, and to the extent possible, to try to quench it. That is a very hard problem, as I understand it. That's a very hard problem, but it's not an impossible problem. That's the one that's going to take months to years. But it will eventually get fixed. It's got nothing to do with the current collection of garbage, that's all. So I guess what I'm saying is, you can try to close it and feel good about that, but it's not going to improve the air quality.
Yeah, I understand. I know it's a long process. So one other thing I would ask, as you move forward with this, talking about, air monitoring in the future. So I really don't care how much that costs. Okay. We have already, as a Bristol, Tennessee resident, my tax dollars have gone to pay you and several other people, and I'm fine with that. And I appreciate the city making that effort. But going forward, as you develop a plan for air monitoring, again, I don't care what it costs, because somebody's going to have to pay for it, and it's not going to be me. So unless it's part of my federal dollars. So I don't care. I don't care what it costs the world, as you said.
Right. Although if you think about it, I mean, one of the reasons I brought up VJ, the Virginia Environmental Justice Act, is now that Mr. Eads has appealed to the Commonwealth of Virginia and to US EPA Region 3, it may be that there are funds that could be liberated through the Virginia Environmental Justice, system. I mean, it might not have to be Bristol, Tennessee paying for it. That's all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, Eric.
I'm Milt Leetsky. I'm a resident of Bristol, Tennessee, and I've been here quite a while. From what I understand, I've done a lot of studying on this. There are two basic systems in place in a landfill. One is the leachate water pumping system, and the other is the gas collection system. Now, I understand the gas wells are supposed to be kept above the leachate water level. And with all of the groundwater infiltration into this landfill, along with the leachate that's coming through the trash, has anybody done any investigation to see how high the leachate and groundwater has gotten in that landfill? And if it has come above the bottom of the gas wells? Because if that water gets above the gas wells, then it will defeat the gas well from working.
Yes, and that is part of the problem. That is one of the that is one aspect of what's going wrong here. This landfill is too wet. You're exactly right.
So the answer, it sounds to me, is that they need to spend more money on fixing the leachate pumping system to get the water level down, and to try to determine how much groundwater infiltration is coming into the landfill, so that they can size pumps adequately to keep the water level down. And that would allow the gas collection system to work better.
Yeah, I will say, I mean, the Bristol, Virginia folks have hired at least 2 sets of consultants. SCS Engineers is an excellent firm. I mean, they're absolutely top notch. Draper Aden is a good firm as well. I think there's lots of engineers working on this. I think it's a matter of they don't have a lot of money, and the problems are very big and long-standing. And the problems have festered for too long, so they're behind the 8 ball. But I do think that both SCS Engineers and Draper Aden, are excellent engineers. And so there's some good minds being put on the problem now.
No, I think some of the questions really get beyond the skill set. that we have.
Yeah, that's true.
We've
I
got a
understand that. I
toxicologist
just,
at-
I just wanted to bring that up because it seems to me that if they can fix the leachate pumping system and get the water level down in that landfill, that a lot of the gas problems would go away.
Yeah,
It's
but
unfortunately not
think
quite
the-
as simple as that. But
I think, I think the comments are fine, but we've got to be careful where we go in
Right.
terms of outside of the scope of our expertise here. Sure. Other questions? Okay, so, yes, please.
I think the name Bristol is the one this would probably go to. But when the testing was being done, was this being done during times that the people were complaining and in areas they were complaining? Or was it areas people had complained, but just at random times? And that's simply because most of the nights it happens 10 o'clock to like 4, 5, 6 a.m. So my question is, when was this testing being done? And in the future, will the testing be done during the hours that it seems to be the most problem for us residents?
Russell, would you like to respond to the testing that you did as you collected those samples? here
Sure,
today?
sure. So our sampling was in the landfill. It was not in the middle of the night. We arrived at the landfill about 5:45 in the morning. Started sampling at the first location just a little bit after 6. We did not get it. They did not. Bristol, the landfill operators didn't want us down in the landfill until it was daylight because there were trucks coming in and out during that time. I mean, a lot of trucks in and out. And so by the time we made it down into the active area, it was mid-morning. So those are the hours that we did the sampling of it. And we tried to catch it early morning. You know, it was a pretty still day that day, so there was very light winds. And the way you expect the atmosphere to behave, you would expect, you know, some of the peak odors in general in the early morning hours. So it wasn't quite, you know, we tried to get it pre-dawn a little bit, and we got basically early into mid-morning for most of the sampling. And that was inside the landfill. There was longer term sampling outside of, you know, that EPA did earlier or DEQ did earlier.
Right, I was going to add that the DEQ sampling, which is what most of the health assessment is based on, is mostly long-term, 8 hours or more, up to 24, up to 30 hours in some cases. So it covered the overnight hours when the wind was very calm. The landfill emissions are likely to be pretty constant with time. They don't vary very much by day or night. But the main problem is what the meteorological conditions are. So the overnight sampling is what was done to get the calm conditions, which is where you get the heavy and the worst smells.
Okay.
Hi, Dr. Green. I hope you can hear me through the mask.
I can, thank you.
All right. And thank you so much for the time and expertise that you've dedicated to this thus far. I am a nursing student at Vanderbilt, and I also work for the VA Department Mountain Home. So I work with vulnerable populations. I work with veterans, and some of them already have pre-existing health conditions, such as already existing cancers.
Yeah.
How does benzene and the emissions that are ongoing at the landfill affect vulnerable populations? That's my first question.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Fortunately, the problems here are not the kind of problems, for the most part, that are going to affect people, for example, who have underlying heart conditions, certain underlying lung conditions. That kind of pollution, high levels of sulfur dioxide, for example, can be very dangerous to such people. High levels of carbon monoxide, CO, can be dangerous to certain kinds of folks with underlying conditions. Noxious fumes and vapors like we have here, and moderately high levels of benzene wouldn't be expected to be any more bothersome or any more dangerous. It's it's annoying pollution, but it's not the kind of air pollution where if someone has unstable angina, for example, high levels of carbon monoxide can be very dangerous for them. But landfill gases, I can't think of any reason that someone with a chronic condition would be any more affected than someone with a very sensitive sense of smell, or your fellow nurse who's got the asthmatic condition. I mean, people with asthmatic conditions would be the most susceptible, but that's not necessarily an age-related issue.
All right, thank you. One more question. I understand that benzene is a rather large molecule. It's kind of heavy. So does that affect the concentration or accumulation of it indoors? I understand that the air samples were ambient air in the atmosphere. Is there going to be any need for indoor air testing?
Yeah, good question. No, at these concentrations, benzene vapors are very well mixed. They don't settle down, they don't rise up, they're just well mixed in the atmosphere and in indoor air samples as well. I think the indoor air problem is the sorption of the odorous compounds onto fabrics. As I was saying before, but perhaps you weren't here, the reason that people's indoor environments are being affected is the same reason that long after someone has smoked a cigarette in a room is what's called third-hand smoke. It's not even secondhand smoke, which is what you get if you're around a smoker, but third-hand smoke is the residue of semi-volatile compounds that have adsorbed into carpets or drapery or upholstery, and then sort of desorb out, over time a little bit. So become sort of incorporated literally into the fabric of the home. So that's what third-hand smoke is. And I believe in some of the indoor environments here in Bristol, Virginia and Bristol, Tennessee, there's essentially third-hand exposure to the landfill gas, not the benzene. Benzene per se will not do this, but some of the semi-volatile compounds that are also odorous, those are the ones that are going to linger.
All right, thank you so much.
Of course, thank you, and good luck in your studies.
Okay, if there are no further questions from our participants, we do have Dr. Green. We do have a remote audience that's viewing this electronically, and we've afforded them the opportunity to email questions, and so we have been screening those questions to avoid redundancy. But with that, John Luttrell with our community relations staff will ask the questions that have been submitted electronically.
Great.
Hi, Dr. Green. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
So I will ask the questions to you as they've been submitted to us throughout the meeting this evening. As Mr. Sora said, some of the questions have been asked and answered. So in the interest of time, we'll go to the ones that we may not have gotten a clear answer on at this point. I'll begin with this one. Looking at the EPA, VDEQ, and Tetra Tech data, there are high spikes in the parts per billion levels of VOCs overnight. This individual posits that the upper limit of these concentrations fell in around 650 parts per billion. Referencing the EPA method TO15,
are the VOC levels that spike and level off overnight of acute or chronic concern relating to carcinogenic, teratogenic, or other similar human health responses to long-ish short-term exposures of roughly 6 to 8 hours overnight?
Wow, great question. Thank you. Thank you, mysterious listener. I don't know yet. I mean, those data literally showed up at about 9 o'clock last night. So as I said in my preliminary report, as Edmund and I said in our preliminary report, we are very much looking forward to adding to our report as more data come in. So I don't have an answer yet, but I'm fixing to have one in a couple weeks.
The next question, and you somewhat alluded to it during the previous question, are there any individuals, in your opinion, who are at higher risk with the data that you've collected or reviewed thus far?
Well, yes, in the sense that some of us are much more bothered by malodors than others, including, by the way, many of us during our pregnancies found that we were hypersensitive to malodors. It's kind of a thing. There are certainly some people with asthma who will be more aggravated than people without asthma. So I would say those are the two sensitive populations, if you will.
The next question is asking, what can people do to mitigate these effects in their homes?
Excellent question. I don't know, but I would, if I felt that I had draperies, for example, that had absorbed this third-hand set of vapors, I'd take them to the cleaners or wash them in my washing machine and see if it helped. I don't know that it'll help, but I do know in experiments with cigarette smoke, I mean, people have, done this in the laboratory or in simulated homes. If you take draperies from homes of smokers and wash them really thoroughly, you can reduce the odors. So if there are textiles that are washable or even dry cleanable, I would try cleaning them and see if it helps. I don't know if it'll help. Shampooing your carpets might help. Anything that is an absorbable fabric, especially cotton or wool, not so much polyester, but any natural fabrics or textiles that to a homeowner or to an occupant, if they seem that they've absorbed some odors, I'd try washing them or dry cleaning them. It works with secondhand smoke, so it might work here.
You could also try using carbon filter air circulation through carbon filters. For example, if you have a whole house air conditioning, you could try using carbon filters in the air conditioning system, or use carbon filters in standalone units blowing air. Now, I don't guarantee that would work, but it would be that's what I would try initially. That's likely. Those carbon filters are likely to absorb most of the stuff that that is not as odorless. And again, I don't guarantee that, and I've not tried it, but that's what I would try first.
It's a good idea.
The next question we received, it was phrased as, is anyone evaluating the local water bodies in response to the detected air concentrations? I would probably paraphrase that and saying not only is anyone, but should anyone be monitoring or evaluating local water bodies in response to the detected air concentrations?
I don't have an opinion about that. I don't really see a need for it. I don't have much of an opinion about it. Sorry.
Okay. The following question, some of the samples that were the basis of the green toxicology report were from 6 months to 1 year old, primarily at locations that haven't been as extremely impacted. The gases have gotten extremely worse since then, probably 3 to 10 times worse, depending on the area, and has expanded drastically in the area that is being impacted. Since the last 6 months have been drastically worse and weren't at the worst locations, would that impact the results in the report?
Yeah, very good question. In our report, we tried to be very worst case, meaning we took the very highest measurement. And if the highest measurement was on the landfill from Russell Bailey's data, we used that measurement and divided it by a very small number to account for offsite migration and dispersion. So if there were 10 samples or 20 samples or 5 samples, we always took the worst case number wherever it was and divided it by a very small number to account for dispersion off the landfill. So we tried to be as worst case as we could. We absolutely appreciate that the sampling program, like any sampling program, is only a set of snapshots in time. And we tried to compensate for that. I think we did a good job of compensating for that. But as I said, US EPA is fixing to come back, and this time they're going to be using brand new SUMA canisters and collecting lots of air. And Russell and Edmund and I and Keegan are going to sit down with Miles Bartos and just make sure that this next round of sampling that EPA is fixing to do is going to be as definitive and as inclusive as it can be.
This next question is along similar lines, stating that these gases hit hot spots and some areas are hit extremely hard for hours at a time and get trapped in homes for much longer than it stays outside. Since the gases come and go within a matter of 30 minutes to a few hours, would that impact or possibly skew the sampling methods used? For example, if a sample taken over a 24-hour period and the gases hit extremely hard for 2 of the 24 hours at potentially hazardous levels, could the huge concentrations be diluted by the clear other 22 hours of air?
Yes, that certainly could happen. That's again why we always use the biggest number we could find. I mean, yeah, it's snapshots in time are just snapshots, and all you can do is take the worst picture you can find. There may be something worse, but you do the best you can with what you have.
The following question is relating to the samples that were taken on site at the landfill. If samples are taken on the ground at the landfill, is it possible that gases which are escaping into the air and going downwind could strengthen downwind compared to on-site at the landfill? And the example given is burning a fire at one's home. Sometimes standing next to the fire, you don't smell the smoke directly beside of it, but it does smell much stronger down the hill. So is there a potential that those smells could strengthen downwind rather than immediately there at the surface of the landfill?
Pretty unlikely. Go ahead, Edmund. Do you want to take that one?
Well, it's unlikely if the samples at the landfill were catching all the nasty stuff coming out. Now, it's possible, it's almost certain that they weren't. They were sampling what was on the surface of the landfill, 2 feet above the surface of the landfill. But of course, they weren't in the direct stuff coming out of the chimneys or the fissures or whatever you want to call them. And it may have been worse right in those. So the concentrations in those could have been, or probably was, substantially higher. There was one sample taken some time ago out of the southeast chimney, directly out of it, and it showed extremely high levels of benzene, for example. So those could be acting as the major sources at the landfill, which were not captured by the samples on the landfill. But those would be diluted downwind substantially, much more than the samples from the surface of the landfill, for example, because of the way they're emitted. And so we took the samples on the landfill and diluted them somewhat, nowhere near as much as we would expect dilution from anything coming out of the chimneys, to estimate a worst case. So we've taken account of that but basically, if it's going downwind, then it's going to get diluted. So it depends where you start.
The last question, there are a couple of parts to this one. This individual understands that the air was sampled for a period of roughly 8 hours rather than what is recommended by the EPA, a time period of 13 hours, and asking if that 8-hour period would be truly representative of the gases, or would the sensitivity be diminished because of the shorter sampling time period.
13 hours, I don't know that that's a thing. Russell, do you have a comment on that?
Sorry. No, not specifically. I'm not sure where the 13 hours comes from. So I know that many of the samples, so when you analyze the samples, they have method detection limits the lab will identify. Some compounds were below those, numerous ones were above it, which shows that enough was captured to accurately measure it. You know, I would say we didn't have unlimited time. We had access from Bristol, Virginia to the landfill for that day for sampling. And so we had to optimize the time we had with the areas that were desired to be sampled.
Yeah, the samples on the landfill were generally shorter than 8 hours even. But again, landfill emissions are likely to be fairly constant. And so the time factor there is mainly to get the sensitivity high enough. You're sampling something which is fairly constant. And so you sample it long enough to get enough of the material to detect it. So the samples taken in the neighborhoods, that's when 8 hours to 24 hours. Well, some of the Virginia samples were grab samples taken over a short period. But we took those into account as well. But for offsite, for the area sample, for the samples in the local area, there's two effects. One is sampling long enough to get enough material to detect. And the other is to take account of the variation in concentration with time. What we were concerned with was mainly getting long estimates for 1 hour or longer averages, because those were what mattered from the point of view of toxicity. At these low levels, it's not the very short peaks that matter, it's longer time frames, so that the samples we needed were averages over at least an hour and preferably longer. And so we used the 8 or 24-hour ones and adjusted as necessary to do comparisons with standards that were for 1 hour or guidelines for 1 hour and 24 hours.
And this individual also asked, and Russell, I believe you may have mentioned this earlier, so apologize if this is a repeat, but what was the weather condition when the samples were taken at the landfill site?
Sure. So the winds were very calm inside the landfill. We held up a wind indicator for direction and velocity, just to basically essentially, practically speaking, a ribbon to see it, and it barely moved off of the it barely moved away from the pole we had it on. So the winds were very calm. It started out right around freezing, and at the time the landfill didn't warm up down in it for a while. So the temperature in the landfill when we left, temperature on the landfill just didn't warm up as much. We were reading like in 40-ish in the afternoon. So a fairly cool day, calm winds, partly cloudy.
That does conclude the questions, the unique questions that we've received online during tonight's meeting. Certainly, if there are any follow-up questions, we may send those your way to communicate back with those folks who have shown an interest that are watching us online this evening. So thank you.
Thank you.
To our panelists, I would thank you for participating in tonight's presentation. I think it's been enlightening. I believe it's been appreciated, sharing the information and the context in which it was shared. I'd like to ask Mayor Luttrell now to come and make some final comments, and then I think we'll close with Sam. Really thank everybody for coming out tonight. I know we've lost some of the crowd that was here, but it's getting kind of late. Might be getting sleepy, but really appreciate your persistence in this. And you just be reassured our persistence is going to be just as equal as what yours is. So with that, I'd like to ask Reverend Sam Weddington to come up and close us in a little prayer.
Let's pray. Lord God, we give you thanks for wisdom and for reason and for conversation and investigation. And we give you thanks for these servants that have shared their time with us this evening and have done this work. And I pray that we will continue as a community to work for solutions, that we will practice patience, but Lord, we will also seek justice. So let us balance those things. And let us grow in our affection for one another and in all things that you might be glorified. For we pray this in the mighty name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.